Hey there. This past fall I moved to a new home. So I had to put all my gear in boxes about a month before moving and didn't get around to unpacking it all and getting my new office completely wired until a couple months after moving in. Everything's good to go now and I'll try to make another video about my current setup. This video though is about a mini system I made to help keep myself sane during those months where I didn't have any of my gear set up. I wanted to make sure I posted this before I took this system apart. I call this the mini ambience generator. It's based on my larger system, but pared down to just the bare essentials that you see here. For being so small, only 64 HP, this is a pretty fun rack to play with. So let me explain to you how I generally use it and what each module is here for. So for the explanation, we'll go from left to right, because that's how I originally set it up. And that's just because how my brain works. That's why I tend to lay things out that way. The first module here on the left is the Batumi. You might notice that this doesn't blink because it's got to be pulled slightly to the left for some reason to activate the LED. I'll have to fix that or send it to Chaos to get it fixed. Batumi acts as my main modulation source. Sometimes I use it as a clock by patching into the square wave outputs here. I generally run it in divide mode, which is this blue one here on the right. This lets you have very slow LFO rates. So the first one acts as the master for them. And then using this column here, which is labeled div, you can see it's got a 2, 3, 4 down to 32. These are the approximate clock divisions for the main slider. So unfortunately, since this first one's broken, you can see that it's blinking here. This one should be blinking at half the rate because it's set to the 2 value. And then if you turn this one up, we'll set this one to 4, or this one to 4, and this one to 3, or 4 and 8. And you'll see that they should be divisions of this main clock here. So if I move this, you'll see they start to get much slower versus much faster. Using the 3 frequency phase divide inputs here on the top row, you can slow down the LFOs to about 53 minutes per cycle. It should also be noted that the second reset input here pauses all the LFOs. This means you can use the Batumi as a sample and hold, provided you're okay with all 3 LFOs stopping. I'll just demonstrate that really quick with the Woggle Bug. So if I plug into the burst output here, every time this light lights up, you should see that these will actually stop at the current value that they're on. The next module, since I'm already talking about it, is the Make Noise Woggle Bug. I prefer using the stepped voltage out of the Woggle Bug to the Batumi for sample and hold because I don't have to interrupt the LFO cycles on the Batumi to grab a sample of voltage. I can just grab it out of the stepped random here. You can also use Woggle Bug as a clock by using this output and this knob here. You'll see the blinking indicator light here to show what the current clock rate is on the inside of the module. Alternatively, if you want to clock the Woggle Bug from something else, like the Batumi, you can use this input jack. For instance, you can plug in the square wave output from the Batumi into here, and it starts to act as a clock. So you can see every time that the light flashes here, it's flashing here. One thing to keep in mind with the Woggle Bug is that the internal clock is always running, regardless of whether it's being bypassed by the input clock. So you can have multiple clocks running in your system at once using this method. You can patch the square wave here, as shown before, but this clock still runs independently. Moving over, this module is the Expert Sleepers Disting Mark IV. I only use this as sample playback, just like in my larger system. This thing, of course, has a lot of other functions, but you have to use this menu system, and you have to have a reference sheet nearby to know what all the different modes are and how each one functions and what all the different outputs do on each. I just have this set to I1, which is pretty much just like the radio music from Music Thing Modular. in that it's just a looping playback of samples. I have this organized such that there are 20 or so banks of audio on this, which you can get through by turning the top knob and select which bank you want. And then the bottom knob goes through the samples in each bank, of which there are 8 each. I do this for 2 reasons. First, if there are too many samples loaded, it can be hard to select one properly. I've noticed that if the knob is somewhat between 2 different samples, sometimes if you have a lot of samples, it'll have a hard time selecting which one it actually wants to play, and it'll kind of like stutter between the 2, which if that's what you're looking for, fine, but that's generally not what I'm trying to do. Second, it takes a long time to switch banks if you have a lot of samples in the bank. This is because it reads all the samples in the bank when you change it. So the more samples you have, the longer it takes for it to read all the samples and then actually start the playback. The A and B jacks in the I1 mode are just stereo outputs left and right respectively. This is one advantage that this thing has over the radio music, in that you can use stereo audio files. Radio music is monophonic. I get my audio samples from a variety of places. My favorite samples to use are probably the Echo Space Detroit sample packs that I bought a while back from their Bandcamp website. Second is probably the Soft Synth Omnisphere, which is great for long evolving pads and things like that. I'll put together another video on how I set up Ableton so I'm able to quickly sample audio from Omnisphere. I also sample some of my own stuff, so usually track ideas that didn't work out but are still kind of interesting. I'll chop them up, I'll put them in here, and then I'll be able to play them back later. I get audio from a few other places, but I think right now that's probably the top 3. Alright, halfway through the system and we have the Morphogene. This is probably my favorite module in the Eurorack ecosystem. I guess you could call it a virtual tape loop, but that would probably be selling short all of its capabilities. So I'm going to try and quickly run down how I use Morphogene. There are plenty of comprehensive videos on how Morphogene works, so I'm just going to go over my methods, which are true both for this system and how I use Morphogene in my larger racks as well. So most importantly on Morphogene are the audio inputs and outputs. This SOS or sound on sound knob controls whether you're listening to the incoming audio or the processed audio, or a mixture of both. I'll get into why that's important soon. So once you get audio in, you want to be able to record it. That's what this record button is for. I modified the Morphogene options file on the SD card to only require that I hit the record button instead of having to hold the splice button and click record at the same time. That's the default configuration. I change it so you just have to hit record once. So if the sound on sound knob is the most used knob, I would say, on this module for me, the next one is going to be Morph. So Morph is what allows you to loop audio over itself. If you look at the Varispeed window here, which I'll get to next, you'll see that as I turn the Morph knob, the color on the opposing side from wherever this knob is facing changes color. With Morph turned all the way down, the color is red, and this means that there's going to be a gap in the virtual tape loop between the end and the start of the recorded sample. When turning the Morph knob, the first time the window turns orange means that you have a semi-seamless loop. Keep going and the window turns red again. So now you have the sample triggered again and playing over itself with an offset based on when you reach this point. A little further and the window turns orange again. Now there are 2 loops playing, and they're looping at the same rate, but with whatever the original offset was from when the second loop started. And this continues. You can have up to 4 different samples playing at once, but once you get past the point where the orange light turns on about here, it's just going to stay on towards the end. At the 4th orange section, something interesting starts to happen. You'll start to hear pitch variations and other odd yet musical things happening, and I'll demonstrate this later. You can change the pitch octave multipliers by editing a file on the SD card in the system. I just have mine set to the default. Okay, that's a quick general overview of the Morph knob. The next function I use most is the Varispeed knob, which is this one here. This changes the playback speed and the pitch of the recorded sample that you have. When the Varispeed window is green, as it is now, that means the sample is playing back at the speed it was recorded. When turning the Varispeed knob, you'll notice that the window changes color. When you turn it up and it gets the light blue, that means the sample is playing back at approximately 1 octave higher than the original recorded speed. When turning it down, you'll see that it starts to turn this white purplish color here. This means it's playing at 1 octave below the recorded speed. And if you turn it down further, you'll eventually get to where it turns white again, and I think this means that it's 2 octaves below the original recorded speed. And now, if you keep going counterclockwise, you'll notice that now the left side starts to show the same colors as the right. But now the sample is playing in reverse. All the same color rules apply. It's just now the sample is going the opposite direction. Gene size and slide, these two knobs here, they're pretty interesting. Gene size changes the end point of the sample, making it shorter the farther clockwise you turn the knob. So this is an extremely short sample, as you can see by the splice light blinking, back to the original sample length. Closely related to the gene size is the slide parameter. This changes where the beginning point of the sample is. Using gene size and slide together, you can sort of picture a moving window on the audio of your sample. So the gene size will make it shorter, and then slide will move that window around at its current size based on your entire sound sample. When you turn gene size up, the audible window of the sample starts to get smaller and smaller, down to microsound sizes. And you can use the slide knob to sort of scrub the sample when you're at very small gene sizes. An interesting use of gene size and slide are to set the gene size small, or just something that's not the full size of the sample, and then use something like the stepped random output of the woggle bug and put that into the slide. And then it'll start to randomly select pieces of your sample to play every time that the stepped voltage changes. The last knob is the organize knob, which I generally leave where it is. It's used to select different samples or splices within the current reel, and the current reel can only be about a couple minutes long. If organize is all the way clockwise as it is here, then when you record something, when you're done recording, it'll automatically select that splice as the next one to play. Mimeophone is next, and this is definitely my favorite delay. Just going over all the functions of it, this here is just the dry and wet knob. The repeats knob controls how many repeats you'll hear. Usually this is labeled as feedback or something like that on other delay devices. You can think of the zone control here as being like a very coarse controller over the delay rate. You'll see as I change zone, it changes the color here. All the way to the left, and you have very short delay times. And all the way to the right, you have very long delay times. What's interesting about the zone control is that it's stepped. What you're actually doing is you're selecting the length of the delay buffer that you want to listen to, but the full delay buffer is always being used. This middle knob here is the rate knob. This one is more of like your typical delay sound, where if you turn it left or right, it's going to stretch left or right depending on which direction you're going in. This is a more fine-grained control, and I usually don't touch this, to be honest. I usually just select which zone I want to be in, and then I let this just stay in the middle. The halo knob here is a reverb-like setting, and what it's doing is it's smearing the sound of the repeats into each other. So it sounds a lot like a reverb, but the way that it works is just, it's slightly different. The last parameter is color. You can think of this as a filter for the delayed sounds. Note that this does not affect the initial dry sound. So you can have the initial dry sound playing, and it won't be filtered by this. This is a filter only for the repeats on the wet side. And you can see down here, there's some inputs and buttons as well. This is the clock input, and this one here is the clock output. So this pulses with the rate here that you see flashing in this window. By using these two jacks together, you can actually clock another module at the same rate what's going into the mimeophone. So you can send the internal clock from the Wogglebug into this, and then send the clock out from here into the Morphogene if you wanted to. This button and jack here are the flip parameter. This is the direction that the repeated audio is going in, forward or reversed. When it's lit, it's going in reverse direction. The hold button will keep playing back whatever's in the audio delay buffer as long as it's lit. I don't think I've ever really used this effectively, to be honest. Probably better for very short sounds, but since I've been dealing mostly in long, evolving, changing soundscapes, it seems to be lost on me. And finally, there's the skew input. You can use this to have the left and the right outputs playing at different rates. I don't use this as often as I probably should, to be quite honest. And that's it for mimeophone. The last module here is the ALM HPO, and this is really just a headphone output. That's what HPO stands for. The great thing about it is it allows you to use this, obviously, with headphones. So when I didn't have speakers or anything hooked up, I could still use HPO and use the system standalone without having to worry about, actually needing speakers. Okay, so let's go through setting up a patch here, and I'll kind of explain it one step at a time so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so where I'll typically start is finding a good sample to play with. Just turn up the audio here. Okay, well I just spun this to some random sample, and this actually sounds pretty good, so I'll sample it with the Morphogene. I typically like samples on the longer side, so I'll let it run for 30 seconds or so. So let's listen to what we had recorded. Okay, so I was just adjusting the volume there because it was clipping a little bit on the output. Now what you notice is that when this loops, you have that little cut there. So what you want to do is adjust the morph so the window turns orange. So it's not going to be a perfect loop, but that's okay because that's not really what we're going for here anyway. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move the morph up. And now we'll start to have the splice starting to play over itself. If I do it again, the splice is going to be looping over itself even more. Don't want to add some delay to that, so I'll turn up the Morphogene. I'll use the color knob to filter out some of the higher frequencies. I'll use the halo to smear some of the repeats together into themselves. So that sounded kind of interesting, but with this being such a small system, you need to have a way to sort of layer sounds on top of each other, and that's where the sound on sound knob comes in. So if I select a new sample, and we don't know what it's going to be, but just select some random sample, and I'll move the sound on sound knob to the middle. Now you have these two sounds playing on top of each other. We have the loop that I had originally made, which is saved in the buffer of the morphogene. And then you have this one over here. So if you have them in the middle, now we can record both. And what I'm going to record here is exactly what you're hearing out of the morphogene. Let me just turn this back to live. Now when I hit record here, you're going to hear exactly, it's going to record exactly what we're hearing. You see this sounds a little bit better, slowed down a bit. Let's turn the morphogene back on. I'm going to put it into a shorter zone. Maybe increase the amount of repeats, the feedback. Let's see how this sounds reversed. I'm going to shorten the size of the loop. And I'm going to set the repeats to 4 genes instead of just 3. So now listen when I turn the morph up past like about 3 o'clock. Now, of course, we can continue to layer this. So let's just select another sample. Sounds like a didgeridoo, okay. So I'm going to adjust the sound on sound now so that I have mostly this didgeridoo. But you can just hear the previous sounds that we were playing with sort of poking over. And now I'm going to record this. And you're probably noticing something interesting here, is that it's taken the sample we recorded, but it's playing it back with all the previous parameters that we had set up. So we take this and we put it back. So now this is what we recorded. But that's one of the most fun things about Morphogene, is that you can record something and then immediately flip back to listen to the Morphogene itself, and it's already manipulated your sample back to whatever the settings were that you had it set to before you did the recording. Okay, so that sounds really interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modulate this color parameter here. And I'm going to use a very slow LFO from Batumi. I'm going to make this even slower. And since it's slower, I'm going to actually make it open the color up even more every time it pulses. Now what you're probably noticing is that I have the mimeophone turned almost all the way up to wet. So we're pretty much just hearing what's being processed from the mimeophone. And because of that, any changes that we do over here in the morphogene are going to be reflected much later, depending on what the zone setting is here. So if I, for instance, change the slide value, you can hear it sliding around, but it's very delayed. And I actually like the way that sounds as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the Wogglebug's smooth output and hook it into the slide parameter here. One fun thing to do with the Verispeed is to sort of simulate a wow and flutter from a cassette tape. And the way you do that is you would patch in some sort of LFO, like let's say, actually let's plug in the woggle output here. And we'll plug it into the Verispeed. So now you can see that it's actually changing the speed based on the woggle here, coming into the Verispeed. And it's just changing it a little bit. Even that little bit, honestly, might be too much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to record this. I'm going to take the Verispeed out for now. All right, well, that certainly took a darker turn, but hopefully you see kind of what this system's all about and how it can kind of be pretty fun. You start to get lost in it depending on, you know, how many times you start to record something and resample it and loop it and play it back and loop it over itself multiple times and then add a bunch of, you know, different repeats to it. And you just start to end up with these textures that are, you know, very interesting. You got the tape and the granular, and then you have the delay and the reverb sounds of the halo, and you can get some really, really cool and fun stuff out of this. There are some problems with the system, and there's a reason that I'm taking it apart. One, I have a Make Noise 7U case, which I'm going to be taking and putting all this stuff into to make a more comprehensive system that's slightly different from my main rack. It's going to be probably based on more generative stuff. And it'll be focused more on actually making sounds itself rather than using samples. So that's something I'm currently playing with, but I'm going to use the components that are in this as a starting point for this new rack. But some of the actual main technical issues I think that I have with this and the modules here that I've chosen are, first of all, the halo setting on the Mimiophone isn't very strong. It's not a traditional reverb. Like I said, what it does is it's smearing the delay sounds themselves together, not really acting as like a diffusive delay that you would get from some sort of dedicated delay module. I had a Monsoon in here actually, which I took out and swapped it for the Wogglebug. So that's only because I felt like more modulation was necessary. Monsoon, if you're not familiar, is a 12 HP clone of Mutable Instruments Clouds. And I swapped it out because I was mostly just using it as a reverb. I was using some of the granular functions of it, but I felt like I just needed more modulation that I would get from the Wogglebug and maybe not necessarily from the Batumi. Like I like the stepped randomness, the sample and hold. And another reason that having a dedicated reverb is better is basically due to the fact that the halo setting on the Mimiophone only works on the wet content. So you need to be listening to the repeats to hear the reverb-ish sound. So that's kind of why I had the Mimiophone for a lot of this, all the way over on the repeats. If it came down to me really feeling like I needed a reverb in this unit, I would probably take the Wogglebug back out and swap it for the Desmodus Versio from Noise Engineering. I have two of those in my other rack, and they're beautiful sounding reverbs. And they're stereo, and they're only 10 HP. I mean, they're phenomenal modules, and highly recommend if you're checking out digital stereo reverbs to check out the Desmodus Versio from Noise Engineering. The only reason I would swap the Wogglebug instead of the Batumi, I do have 2 HP here. The Batumi's 8 HP, so I could take this spacer out and the Batumi and still be able to fit the Desmodus Versio. But the only reason that I would swap the Wogglebug over the Batumi is because the Batumi simply has more outputs. It's not as versatile, I think, as the Wogglebug, but the Batumi has more modulation points, so I can modulate more stuff. I didn't do a lot of that in this demo patch, only because I was just working mostly with the Morphology and the Mimiophone. There's not a huge need for modulation in this, but I like to have the sort of option of being able to modulate a lot if I want to. Also, you may be noticing there's no VCAs in this system. That's problem's pretty much mitigated by the fact that most of the parameters on the Morphogene and the Mimiophone have attenuverters built onto them already. So, that's not really a huge issue. And also, if you switch the Batumi into quad mode, you'll notice that even though you're only getting a phased output, what you are getting though is the ability to control the amplitude. So this sort of acts as a VCA for an LFO, but unfortunately means that you have 4 LFOs that are running at the same rate, but you can have different intensities. So not quite exactly what I want to do, because I would want to have more LFO rates than just one. I'd want to have the 4 full LFO rates, but then be able to control the strength as well, which you're not able to do in this mode. Another problem, which isn't an issue because I swapped out the Monsoon, which was 12 HP, and gave me 2 extra HP of space here, which I could put this blank in. The problem is this particular case, the Pod 64X from 4MS, there's no screw hole on the far left and on the far right. And that means that the HPO, if it's all the way over on the right, which it was before, needs to be flipped upside down to be able to mount it, because there's no screw holes there for it to fit into. The only other issue, I think, and again, this comes down to the case, is it's a small case, but that's the purpose of it. However, it only has 6 power headers in the back. You can use a flying bus cable to expand it a little bit, but you know, provided the power supply can handle all the different modules that you're putting in. I don't recommend this, not because of the power requirements. I don't recommend it because putting too many small modules into a case means that it starts to become very difficult to deal with. So right now, even like these knobs are a little bit difficult to deal with, and this volume knob here is difficult, but that's, you know, it's just, that's the size of the knob, and I always have a problem with 2 HP units, but you know, this is one of those like set or forget, probably don't have to be too concerned about it. So anyways, that's a explanation of this system, and you know, it's, like I said, it's a lot of fun. It kept me sane for a few months while my studio was disconnected. I would be able to just plug it in, put some headphones on, and be able to play with sounds, and especially, you know, my two favorite modules here, the Morphagene and the Mimeophone. And yeah, I think it makes some pretty interesting sounds here. You know, it's, like I said, it's a little bit not as fully featured as my larger rack because it's limited in HP, but for the size, it can do an awful lot of stuff in the realm of, you know, tape-like manipulation and emulation, and also granular stuff if you get into, you know, really small gene sizes and the slide parameter of the Morphagene. So anyways, hope you enjoyed it, and hope you got something out of it. Thanks.